So picture this. It's 196 BCE, right?
Okay.
And the most powerful people in ancient Egypt are putting on a play. But they didn't view it as, like, a pleasant evening of entertainment.
No, not at all.
They viewed it as a literal, functional cosmic engine, like a highly restricted mechanism that was absolutely required to keep the sun from dying.
Yeah, to literally hold back the chaotic forces of the universe.
Exactly. Today, we call it theater, but they called it survival.
Which is such a massive paradigm shift.
It really is. I mean,
Right.
you probably picture something very different when you hear the word theater. You know, you imagine a dark room, a plush velvet seat, maybe a ticket in your pocket.
Right, people on a brightly lit stage just pretending to be someone else.
Yeah, we treat it as this structured piece of entertainment. But what if the true roots of performance are intimately entangled with, like, the very invention of human communication?
And cognitive brain hacks.
Yes, and a 2.5 millennia-old prejudice against the whole concept of faking it.
The paradigm shift required to understand this is just immense because the act of performance is inextricably linked to how we process reality as human beings.
Right.
It dictates how we store data and how we understand our place in the universe. Our modern conception of performance is actually a really recent, highly specific cultural byproduct.
So we have a massive stack of research to guide us through this today. We're primarily drawing on the historical synthesis from the 3rd edition of Theatre Histories, an introduction.
Yeah, which is authored by an incredibly esteemed group of scholars.
Right. Tobin Nelhaus, Bruce McConaughey, Carol Fisher-Sorgenfrey, and Tamra Underreiner. And the mission for this deep dive is to really track that world-altering shift.
From purely oral societies to early literate cultures.
Exactly. We're exploring how the way you communicate, whether you're speaking, singing, or carving hieroglyphs into stone, completely dictates how you perform and how you remember. Okay, let's unpack this.
It's a huge topic.
It is. And before we can even touch on the origins of theater, we have to look at the mechanics of history itself.
Yeah, we really have to understand the lens through which we view the past.
Right. Like, how do historians actually decide what is true?
Well, the thing is, history is actively constructed. It's not just this, timeline of dry, objective facts waiting to be uncovered in some perfect sequence.
It's not just sitting there under the dirt.
Exactly. The study of how history is written, which is called historiography, requires historians to choose a specific framework.
A model, basically.
Right, a model of how society operates, just so they can interpret the raw data. And the research highlights 3 distinct models that scholars have traditionally used.
And the choice of model completely changes the narrative of the past, right?
100%. So the first one is methodological individualism. This posits that history is driven almost entirely by the choices of great individuals.
Okay, so like the great man theory.
Basically, yeah. It assumes that society is merely a static backdrop against which a few singular figures act entirely independent of their social contexts.
I mean, that essentially treats history like a Hollywood screenplay.
Pretty much.
You know, a lone hero makes a decision, and the world pivots on that single axis. It just completely ignores the socioeconomic pressures or, like, the cultural inertia that forces that individual into that position in the first place.
Right, it's too simple. But then the pendulum swings completely in the opposite direction with the second model, which is functionalism.
Oh, functionalism.
Yeah, and functionalism basically reduces people to cogs in a massive societal machine.
Wow.
Under this view, the overarching structures and rules of a society are so dominant, so all-encompassing, that individuals possess almost no true agency.
They're just following a script.
Exactly. They're simply following pre-written sociological roles designed to keep the society functioning smoothly.
So if someone starts a revolution...
Functionalism would argue that the revolution was an inevitable pressure release valve built into the system itself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, rather than a genuine disruption caused by human agency.
But neither of those really feels entirely true to the lived human experience, you know?
No, they don't.
I mean, people make choices, sure, but they make choices within a framework they didn't invent. Which leads us to the third approach, right?
Yes. The transformational model, which is the one the scholars in our research actually favor.
Because it's more nuanced.
Way more nuanced. This model argues that individuals and society are constantly, recursively shaping each other, but they are never perfectly synchronized.
And that lack of synchronization is where history actually happens.
Exactly. Because individuals and structures are always pushing against one another, history cannot be this neat sequence of well-defined eras.
Like, a society doesn't just wake up on January 1st of a new century and completely discard its old worldview.
No, not at all. one historical era begins to germinate long before the previous one is concluded.
Right.
So you get these overlapping periods, incremental adjustments, and sudden volatile upheavals.
Wait, so history isn't just a single file line of events. It sounds more like a crowded highway.
I like that analogy.
Yeah, like you have cars moving at vastly different speeds. You've got the fast lane of rapid technological or political innovation zooming past.
And the slow lane.
Exactly. The slow lane is occupied by deeply entrenched religious or cultural traditions that literally haven't changed in centuries.
Yeah, just because a new era officially starts on a timeline doesn't mean the old vehicles just disappear from the road.
They're still driving right next to the new ones, probably trading paint.
The friction on that highway is a perfect way to visualize it. And navigating that friction requires historians to be hyper-vigilant against cultural relativity.
That's a big one.
It's huge. It's the very real danger of projecting modern contemporary biases onto the past.
Because we naturally assume that people hundreds or thousands of years ago processed the world using the same fundamental logic we use today.
Right, but their physical realities dictated entirely different conceptual frameworks.
Can you give an example from the sources?
Yeah, take the concept of the Great Chain of Being. This dominated the Middle Ages and the Renaissance in Europe.
Which completely reframes how we should look at historical architecture.
Exactly. Because the Great Chain of Being wasn't just an abstract philosophical thought experiment.
It was literal.
It was a vertical categorization of the entire universe. Everything was ranked in a strict, unyielding hierarchy.
You had rocks and dirt at the very bottom.
Right, moving up through plants, animals, human serfs, knights, dukes, the king, the angels, and ultimately God at the absolute apex.
And that vertical worldview manifested physically in the built environment, didn't it?
It did. In the 17th century, European theaters incorporated this new technology of scenic perspective.
The painted backdrops.
Yeah, painting backdrops to create the illusion of three-dimensional depth. But the mathematics of that forced perspective were engineered so that the illusion only resolved perfectly from one precise spatial coordinate in the entire building.
Which was the king's seat.
Exactly, the king or the ruling duke.
Wow.
If you sat even a few feet to the left or right of that central seat, the vanishing point of the painted scenery skewed.
The illusion was totally distorted.
Right, so the architecture of the building was actively enforcing the vertical hierarchy of the Great Chain of Being.
That is wild. Every other person in that audience was physically reminded through their fractured view of the stage that their perspective was secondary to the monarch's.
The building itself is a piece of political technology.
But as democratic, egalitarian ideas began to permeate Europe in the subsequent centuries.
Ideas that emphasize a horizontal structure of society rather than a vertical one?
Right, the physical spaces had to change. By the late 19th century, architectural design shifted to fan-shaped auditoriums or raked seating,
Which provided every ticket holder with a relatively equal, unobstructed view of the stage.
So if a modern historian looks at a 17th century theater and assumes the seating was just poorly designed, they're falling victim to cultural relativity.
Exactly. They are completely missing the sociological engineering embedded in the floor plan.
Which brings us to the search for theater's origins. What came first? Because this same vulnerability to cultural projection is responsible for one of the most persistent myths in theater history.
Oh, the search for a singular sacred origin.
Yes.
So in the early 1900s, a classical scholar named Gilbert Murray proposed a very elegant evolutionary timeline.
Right.
He suggested that Greek tragedy evolved directly and smoothly out of ancient religious rituals.
It presented a neat, linear progression from sacred worship to secular art.
And it is completely false.
The research is highly critical of this, isn't it? They actually call it a zombie idea.
A zombie idea, yeah. Because by the 1920s, subsequent scholars had completely dismantled Murray's hypothesis.
They demonstrated that his methodology was deeply flawed.
Deeply flawed. He had cherry-picked specific pieces of evidence that supported his evolutionary timeline and just conveniently ignored massive amounts of data that contradicted it.
He assumed an outcome and forced the historical record to fit his premise.
Right. Yet despite being academically debunked a century ago, this theory refuses to die. It is still taught in classrooms today.
Why? Why do we hold on to it?
What's fascinating here is the psychological necessity behind the persistence of that zombie idea.
Okay, tell me more.
People desperately want to believe this debunked theory because it provides the art form with a profound spiritual pedigree.
Ah, I see. If theater is just a secular invention for entertainment, it feels pedestrian.
Exactly. But if it is the direct descendant of sacred communion with the gods, it retains an aura of magic and vitality.
So practitioners and even some historians prioritize the subjective, inspirational resonance of that idea over the messy, nonlinear facts of history.
They do. They really do.
Well, returning to our highway analogy, just because an ancient religious ritual happened in the same geographic location and roughly the same century as a theatrical play.
That does not mean the ritual birthed the play.
Right. There's simply two different vehicles occupying the same stretch of road, shaped by the same cultural environment.
Exactly. And if we discard the comfort of the ritual origin theory, we have to look for the actual catalyst that shifted performance from a communal sacred duty into something resembling modern theater.
And spoiler alert, the catalyst wasn't religious.
No, it wasn't.
It was a technological revolution. It was the invention of writing.
The disruption caused by writing cannot be overstated. It was huge.
To comprehend how a communication technology alters human cognition, we have to look at a concept known as the primacy of practice.
Right. This theory addresses how human knowledge and conceptual logic are actually formed in the first place.
Because the classical assumption is that thought is pure, abstract logic occurring in a vacuum.
But the primacy of practice flips that. It argues that human thought is fundamentally constructed by our physical, bodily interactions with our immediate environment.
So we build our mental architecture using physical blueprints.
Exactly. The classic example in cognitive linguistics is the interaction with a container.
Oh, like a bucket.
Yeah. When a young child physically places blocks into a bucket and takes them out again, they are not just playing.
They're learning.
They are forming a core conceptual schema of inside and outside. That physical, tactile practice becomes the foundational metaphor for highly abstract thought later in life.
The physical schema maps onto the conceptual abstract.
Yes. Because you have physical experience with containers, you can understand a sentence like, the company is operating outside the law.
Or, she feels boxed in by her career.
Right. Another primary schema is the source path goal concept, which we derive entirely from the physical act of walking or moving through space.
We conceptualize time and progress through the mechanics of our own locomotion.
Exactly. Leading to phrases like, we are approaching the deadline, or he has a long road ahead of him.
Our bodies literally dictate our metaphors. That is incredible.
It is. So if physical interaction shapes cognitive architecture, then our primary modes of communication, how we transfer data to one another.
They must dictate our conceptual models of reality.
Exactly. In a purely oral culture, where knowledge is transferred via breath, sound, and physical proximity, the understanding of truth is immediate and communal.
But the introduction of the phonetic alphabet in ancient Greece severed the knower from the known.
The alphabet allowed information to be stored outside the human body for the very first time.
It was a cognitive earthquake.
It created a massive philosophical friction as the new literate mindset clashed with the traditional oral mindset.
And no one embodies this friction more profoundly than the philosopher Plato?
Oh, Plato, yes, in the 4th century BCE.
Because Greek drama was at its cultural zenith, right? And it was heavily reliant on the oral traditions of epic poetry and communal performance.
And Plato found this entirely unacceptable.
He hated it.
He aggressively condemned theater, poetry, and painting, basically any discipline rooted in mimesis or imitation.
But the mechanics of why he hated imitation are crucial here.
Right. Plato's entire philosophy rested on the theory of forms.
Right, his big idea.
He posited that true reality did not exist in the physical world, but rather in a realm of perfect, abstract ideals.
So a physical chair is just a flawed, temporary manifestation of the perfect abstract concept of a chair.
Exactly. Therefore, a painting of a chair is a copy of a copy. It moves the viewer further away from truth.
So when an actor steps onto a stage and pretends to be a character, they are engaging in a deceitful illusion.
Plato argued that theater bypassed rational thought and directly manipulated the unruly emotions of the audience,
pulling them deeper into the world of false appearances.
He viewed the physical embodiment of theater as a dangerous distraction from the pursuit of pure, abstract reason.
Reason that was increasingly being codified through the new technology of writing.
Yes. Yet there is a deep structural paradox in Plato's philosophy.
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, while he utilized writing to articulate his ideas, he actually argued that the spoken word was superior to the written word.
Here's where it's really interesting. Plato argued that speech was a living, breathing entity connected directly to the soul of the speaker.
But writing, in his view, was dead.
Right.
It was a mere imitation of speech. It couldn't answer back if you questioned it, It just repeated the same static words.
Yeah. So Plato hates imitation. He hates theater because it imitates life.
Right.
He hates writing because it imitates speech. And how does he choose to distribute these philosophies?
He writes books.
He writes books, and not just any books, he writes dialogues.
Yes, he scripts conversations between characters like Socrates and his students.
To attack the concept of the script, he literally wrote scripts. It's the ancient equivalent of someone complaining about the evils of modern technology while posting a massive rant on a social media platform.
It's so true. The philosopher Jacques Derrida actually analyzed this exact paradox in the 20th century.
Ah, what did he say about it?
Derrida coined the term phonocentrism to describe this deeply ingrained Western preference for speech over writing.
The assumption that the spoken word is closer to truth and presence.
Right. And Derrida theorized that phonocentrism inherently breeds anti-theatricality.
Yeah. Because Plato and the thinkers who came after him viewed the written text as a secondary, potentially deceptive copy of pure speech.
So they apply that exact same structural distrust to the theater.
The actor's performance is viewed as a deceptive copy of reality.
Exactly. Theater and the hatred of theater anti-theatricality are siblings.
They were birthed simultaneously from the immense cultural trauma of transitioning from an oral society to a literate one.
And that prejudice is encoded into our language today.
It totally is. You know, when a pundit dismisses a political protest as just political theater.
Or when someone is criticized for being a drama queen.
Yes, that is the echo of a 2,500-year-old bias. We still fundamentally equate theatricality with deception and fakeness.
We do. And to fully grasp the magnitude of what the written word disrupted, we have to look closely at the mechanics of the oral cultures that preceded it.
Right. We have to analyze how a society preserves thousands of years of complex data without external storage drives.
Laws, genealogies, survival techniques, cosmologies, all of it.
They had to engineer the human mind to hold the archive.
They really did. In a world without the cloud, you have to utilize specific cognitive hacks to make vast amounts of information entirely unforgettable.
And the research provides a phenomenal breakdown of these mnemonic technologies by examining Homer's epic poetry.
Specifically, the Odyssey.
Right, because these epics were not written by a solitary genius sitting at a desk.
No, they were composed, refined, and transmitted orally over centuries before the Greek alphabet even existed.
The text directs our attention to a specific scene early in the Odyssey, right?
Yeah, where Odysseus' son, Telemachus, travels to Pylos to seek information from the elder king, Nestor.
And upon his arrival, Nestor's community is engaged in a feast on the beach.
Right. And without even asking who he is, they immediately welcome Telemachus, take him by the hand, and seat him on soft fleece to share their food.
On the surface, it's a simple narrative beat.
But structurally, it is dense with cognitive hacks.
Like what? What's the most prominent one?
The most prominent is the use of verbal formulas.
Oh, the epithets.
Yes. The thoughtful Telemachus, the gray-eyed goddess Athena, rosy-fingered Dawn.
Exactly. Modern readers often view these as repetitive poetic flourishes, but they serve a vital mechanical function.
They are standardized rhythmic building blocks.
Because oral epics were composed in strict metrical patterns, specifically dactylic hexameter, the storyteller needed prepackaged phrases that perfectly fit the rhythm of the line.
It reduces the cognitive load of composing on the fly.
It acts as a mental buffer.
Oh, I see.
While the bard is delivering the formulaic phrase about the gray-eyed goddess, their brain is already sequencing the narrative data for the next 3 lines.
That is brilliant. Furthermore, the overall structure of the epic relies on episodic modular narratives, right?
Yes. In a highly literate culture, we expect tightly woven chronological plots where every scene relies on the previous one, like a novel.
But oral epics function more like modular building blocks.
You can detach the entire scene of Telemachus visiting Nestor, or the sequence of Odysseus blinding the Cyclops, and the overarching architecture of the epic does not collapse. This modularity gives the storyteller immense tactical flexibility.
It really does. Depending on the reaction of the audience, the time of night, or the specific cultural context of the festival, the performer can snap these narrative blocks together in whatever sequence is most effective.
Expanding or contracting the runtime at will.
Exactly. Another highly efficient memory technology is the deployment of extreme symbolic imagery.
Okay, give me an example of that.
Like the Greek sea monster Scylla, with her 6 long necks and terrifying heads.
Or the Hindu goddess Kali, depicted with a garland of human heads, a skirt of arms, and multiple hands holding specific weapons.
Right. To a literate mind accustomed to reading fantasy novels, those just seem like highly imaginative monster designs.
But in the architecture of oral memory, the grotesque or the highly unusual is incredibly sticky.
It lodges in the brain much more securely than a description of a normal human.
Those multi-limbed figures are essentially zip files.
That's a great way to put it. The striking visual image is the folder, and every individual arm, every specific weapon held in a hand, is a compressed packet of cultural or theological data.
The storyteller recalls the image of Kali and then systematically unzips the data associated with each of her attributes during the performance.
This raises an important question regarding characterization.
Okay, what's that?
Well, modern readers frequently observe that the heroes in ancient epics, whether it's Achilles, Gilgamesh, or Beowulf, appear remarkably flat.
Yeah, they lack the deep, contradictory, internal psychological lives that we expect from modern protagonists.
They do not spend pages agonizing over their childhood traumas.
No, they are defined entirely by outward actions and singular dominant traits. You know, the brave warrior, the cunning trickster, the wise elder.
And the reflex of modern literary criticism is to assume that ancient storytellers just hadn't mastered the art of character development yet.
That they lacked the psychological sophistication of a Shakespeare or a Chekhov.
But that is applying the lens of a print culture to an oral culture.
Precisely the kind of cultural relativity we must avoid.
Exactly. The concept of a private, isolated inner psychological life is heavily tied to the practice of silent reading.
Which did not become widespread until much later in history.
Right. In an oral culture, characters are flat, because that is the absolute most efficient protocol for transmitting data across hundreds of generations.
A character with a singular, highly defined outward trait is resilient against the erosion of time.
But a character with a nuanced, subtle, shifting internal landscape is incredibly fragile.
Those nuances will just be forgotten or altered by the third generation of storytellers.
Exactly. The characters are optimized for survival.
And we still have access to highly trained cultural specialists operating within these robust oral traditions today.
We do. The research highlights the griots, or jelly, of West Africa.
Specifically in regions like Mali.
Right. These individuals are not simply entertainers. They are living archives.
They function as historians, diplomats, genealogists, and bards.
And while anyone in the community might know the basic outline of a cultural myth, the griot undergoes rigorous, lifelong training to master the exact linguistic and performative transmission of the culture's vital data.
The physical and cognitive stamina required is just staggering.
A master griot might hold epics in their memory that exceed 8,000 lines of verse.
Just to contextualize that, the entire Old English epic of Beowulf is roughly 3,182 lines.
Yeah, it's immense. But there is a crucial mechanical distinction in how a griot, or a Homeric bard, performs this data compared to an actor in a conventional theater.
And it lies in the use of quoted speech.
Exactly. When a griot performs a dialogue between two legendary figures, they do not psychologically become the figure.
They narrate the exchange.
They will say, Sundiata said to his rival, and then deliver the line. They maintain their identity as the storyteller reporting the action.
But in the theatrical tradition, the actor fully embodies the character.
Right. They do not announce, Hamlet said to himself. They manifest Hamlet in the present moment.
The griot operates alongside the narrative. The actor is consumed by it.
So the storyteller manages the narrative, historical data of the culture.
But we must also examine how an oral culture manages its physical and spiritual interaction with the cosmos in real time.
And that mechanism is ritual.
However, we must aggressively discard the modern Western connotation of the word ritual.
I really do. We typically imagine a solemn, quiet environment, a rigid script, and a congregation sitting in passive observation.
But the research directs us to the Yoruba culture of West Africa to demonstrate a fundamentally different paradigm of sacred performance.
The Yoruba cosmological worldview is profoundly dynamic.
It is entirely structured around the concept of balance and symmetry.
But not static balance. It is an active, vibrating tension between opposing forces.
You have the hot deities, the orishas, who are volatile, full of boundless kinetic energy, provoking rapid action and change.
But unchecked heat destroys, so they must be constantly counterbalanced by cool deities.
Who radiate patience, gentleness, and stability.
Exactly. You have Esu, the unpredictable trickster god, who rules the crossroads and introduces chaos, balanced against Orunmila, the god of fate and divine order.
And the tension between Esu and Orunmila is basically the engine of the universe.
It is, because if fate dictates everything, society stagnates. The trickster is necessary to introduce the chaos required for growth and adaptation.
There is a Yoruba proverb cited in the research that perfectly encapsulates this physics of existence.
The world is a market, the other world is home.
The implications of that metaphor are massive.
Huge! If the spiritual realm of the ancestors is your permanent, stable home, then your physical life is merely a temporary excursion to a marketplace.
And a market is loud, transactional, impermanent, and highly contingent.
You're constantly negotiating, trading, and adapting to the forces around you.
Life is not a rigid test. It is a continuous, fluid process of balancing these hot and cool forces.
Consequently, their religious rituals cannot be rigid or static, because a static ritual would fail to reflect the reality of the marketplace.
That makes total sense. Scholar Margaret Thompson Druell utilizes an actor-centered approach to study Yoruba performance, right?
Yes, fundamentally shifting the focus from the script to the performer.
She observed that the true efficacy of Yoruba ritual does not reside in the flawless execution of a memorized sequence.
No, the power, the actual spiritual technology of the ritual, lives in the active engagement of the participants.
It requires improvisation.
It requires what Druell terms playing in the moment.
They intentionally build flexibility into the sacred space.
They do. The research outlines the concept of ida oro, which translates to inverted discourse.
The community actively appreciates indirect truths, irony, and even occasional misbehavior or idiosyncrasy during a ritual.
The goal isn't robotic perfection. The goal is vital, living energy.
So if a performer rigidly follows a script without adapting to the energy of the crowd, the ritual is considered dead.
Exactly. And the supreme manifestation of this dynamic play is the Igangun Masquerade spectacle.
Tell me about that.
This is a highly complex annual festival honoring the spirits of the ancestors, effectively opening a channel between the permanent home of the other world and the marketplace of the living.
And the festival commences at night, initiating a period of intense sensory control.
The spirit called Agan arrives in the center of the town. Because it is strictly forbidden for non-members of the Igangun society to visually witness, again, the entire uninitiated population must lock themselves indoors.
So the ritual begins with sensory deprivation. The community can only hear what is happening outside.
Right. The society members utilize specific bata drum rhythms, known as alawasi, to summon and represent the spirit.
The acoustic engineering here is brilliant.
It really is. The drummers manipulate the tension and the striking technique on the skins to perfectly simulate the sound of Agan, which the culture describes as a small, quick, light drizzling rain.
The acoustic environment prepares the psychological space for the ancestors.
Following this invocation, the public masquerade begins. And it operates on that same modular, episodic structure we saw in oral epics.
Various maskers representing different ancestral spirits or cultural concepts enter the space to perform independent segments.
Druell's research highlights one specific performance that perfectly illustrates the concept of sacred play.
The appearance of the gorilla mask, or inoki.
Yes, inoki is tied to a specific Igungun origin myth. But the physical manifestation of the mask is startling to a Western observer expecting solemnity.
In the performance Druell documented, the masker wore a costume featuring highly naturalistic carved wooden testicles and a red-tipped penis.
The masker is heavily costumed, anonymous, and channeling this primal, animalistic energy right in the middle of the sacred festival.
And the interaction with the crowd is entirely improvisational and deeply subversive.
The bata drums lock into a specific rhythm, sabala sabala sao, that acoustically mimics the erratic, thrusting movements of the gorilla's sexuality.
Guided by this rhythm, the masker, fully embodying the erratic nature of the gorilla, stalks through the dense crowd.
He specifically targets unsuspecting women, sneaking up behind them and playfully simulating an attack or a sexual advance.
We tend to think of sacred ritual as a solemn, quiet church service, but this is chaotic, funny, and deeply interactive.
The audience doesn't respond with shock or religious outrage. They respond with uproarious, chaotic laughter.
Because the crowd's attention is fractured across the marketplace, the gorilla constantly catches new victims off guard, generating rolling waves of amusement.
It is deeply physical, highly transgressive comedy.
It's less like a rigid ceremony and closer to an elite improv comedy troupe reacting to the crowd in real time.
And the laughter is not a distraction from the ritual. The laughter the ritual.
By introducing this chaotic, highly physical, humorous element, The community is actively balancing the solemn heavy weight of the ancestral spirits with the light, volatile energy of the living.
Furthermore, the Egungun masquerade is relentlessly contemporary. It does not exist in a sealed historical vacuum.
The maskers frequently engage in brilliant improvisational parodies of external forces, including Western colonizers.
The research notes that performers might enter the ritual space wearing a formal European tuxedo or a Second World War gas mask, moving in exaggerated, stiff ways to mock the colonizers.
They are absorbing the trauma and the absurdity of changing historical circumstances, even the imposition of European colonialism, and processing it through the technology of traditional ritual.
By parodying the colonizer within the sacred space of the ancestors, they are asserting spiritual dominance over the external threat.
It's a real-time defense mechanism. The ritual is a journey of discovery, an elite form of spiritual improv comedy with profound cosmic stakes.
We have observed the immense flexibility, the communal access, and the dynamic play inherent in purely oral traditions.
But the historical trajectory shifts dramatically when a society develops the technology to lock data into a physical medium.
We must transition to the early literate societies, specifically focusing on the ancient civilizations of Mesoamerica and Egypt.
Because when writing is invented, it is not immediately democratized.
No, the power to freeze communication in time is immensely potent, and in these early empires, that power was strictly hoarded by a tiny elite.
The mechanisms of writing in these cultures were deliberately, staggeringly complex.
We are not talking about a simple 26-letter phonetic alphabet.
Right. You had systems utilizing logograms, where a single complex symbol represents an entire concept or word.
Intermixed with syllabaries, where characters represent specific phonetic syllables.
The barrier to entry for literacy required decades of specialized study.
The Rosetta Stone, inscribed in 96 BCE, serves as a perfect visual artifact of this sociological stratification.
It displays the same decree written in 3 distinct scripts, right?
Yes, formal Egyptian hieroglyphs at the top, the everyday Demotic script in the middle, and ancient Greek at the bottom.
It maps the layers of access within the society.
The vast majority of the Egyptian population remained entirely oral.
The written word, the ability to interact directly with the state's archives and the gods' decrees, was restricted to perhaps 1% of the population.
The royalty, the high priests, and the state-sanctioned scribes.
And when you restrict literacy, you restrict who gets to define reality.
To understand how this restricted literacy intersected with performance, we have to examine the Egyptian cosmological engine.
Similar to the Yoruba, Egyptian theology was fundamentally concerned with maintaining balance against a universe that wanted to tear itself apart.
They focused on the equilibrium between life and death, the cyclical flooding of the Nile versus the arid desert, and the constant war between order, known as Ma'at, and chaos, known as Isfet.
The master narrative that encoded this physics of the universe was the myth of Osiris.
The Osiris myth is the foundational blueprint of Egyptian power.
Osiris, the righteous king representing divine order and fertility, is murdered by his jealous brother, Set, the embodiment of chaos in the sterile desert.
And Set doesn't simply assassinate Osiris. He dismembers the body into 14 pieces and scatters them across the geography of Egypt, effectively shattering the order of the universe.
Osiris's sister wife, Isis, and her sister Nephthys embark on a desperate quest to locate the scattered pieces.
Through powerful magic, they reassemble and briefly revive him.
Long enough to conceive a child.
Yes. Osiris then descends to become the ruler and judge of the underworld.
And their son, Horus, grows up to battle Set, ultimately reclaiming the throne of the living world.
This is not just a fairy tale, this is political biology.
The living pharaoh is viewed as the literal, earthly manifestation of Horus.
When the pharaoh dies, he becomes Osiris in the underworld, and his successor becomes the new Horus.
The myth legitimizes the unending continuity of the absolute monarchy.
And to ensure that the mechanics of this myth continue to function in reality, the state organized massive, elaborate commemorative rituals.
The most heavily documented of these, and a massive point of debate among theater historians, is the ritual held at the sacred city of Abydos during the Middle Kingdom.
And the only reason we have any insight into this event is because of a single artifact produced by the literate elite.
A stone stele, inscribed by a chief priest and state treasurer named Ikernofert.
Ikernofert stele is a remarkable, bureaucratic, and performative document.
It details his commission by the pharaoh to travel to Abydos and organize the great festival of Osiris.
He was effectively operating as the producer, the director, the set designer, and the lead performer.
He describes organizing the logistics, securing the gold, silver, lapis lazuli, and cedar to meticulously refurbish the Bark of Neshmet.
The Bark of Neshmet was this spectacular sacred boat shrine.
The actual statue of Osiris, the physical vessel for the god's energy, was housed inside a cabin on this boat, shielded from the public gaze.
And carried in a massive, chaotic procession from the temple to the god's tomb and back.
But Akhrenofert was not just managing the crowd or directing the procession from the sidelines.
The text inscribed on the stele is highly active.
He declares, "I championed Osiris on the day of the great combat. I beat back those who attacked the bark. I overthrew the enemies of Osiris."
He physically participated in a massive, violent reenactment of the mythic battle between the forces of order and the followers of Set.
This specific claim that he played a role in a scripted physical combat forces us to confront the definition of performance.
Was Akhrenofert an actor? Was the Abydos ritual officially a piece of theater?
So what does this all mean? If it looks like a play and acts like a play, why do historians hesitate to call it theater? Was this officially theater?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to respect the fundamental metaphysical assumptions of the society that produced it.
Okay, unpack that for me.
In the worldview of ancient Egypt, cosmology, history, and physical reality were completely indistinguishable.
The myths were not allegories, they were the literal mechanics of the universe.
When the Greeks developed theater, they eventually separated the performance from religious necessity.
Right. It became a forum for civic debate, philosophical inquiry, and artistic achievement.
But the Abydos drama had no interest in artistic merit. It was a functional, highly engineered tool deployed to maintain literal cosmic equilibrium.
Akhrenofert wasn't hoping the audience would appreciate the emotional nuance of his performance.
He wasn't acting for the crowd. The audience was the fabric of the universe itself.
If he failed to perform the combat, the sun might not rise, the river might not flood. It was spiritual infrastructure maintenance.
Exactly the point. He was not representing a character. He was manifesting a cosmic duty.
And because the technology of writing, and therefore the power to officially interpret and record these cosmic narratives, was entirely restricted to the elite class of priests and royals,
The performance functioned as an impregnable reinforcement of the state's power.
the physical performance proved the truth of the written decree, and the written decree authorized the physical performance.
The general oral population could participate in the procession. They could wail in mourning for Osiris, but the script remained entirely under the control of the literate state.
It is staggering to consider the sheer weight of that responsibility. A society where the physical reenactment of a story is the only thing keeping the forces of chaos from swallowing the world whole.
It's a completely different way of existing.
We have covered an immense expanse of human cognitive and cultural evolution today.
We really have.
For you listening, we began with the intricate cognitive hacks, the formulas, the modular architecture, the grotesque zip files that allowed oral storytellers like the griots to sustain the memory of entire civilizations through the sheer stamina of the human brain.
We witnessed how cultures like the Yoruba utilized physical comedy, transgressive play, and acoustic engineering to actively balance the hot and cool forces of their reality.
And we examine how the invention of restricted literacy allowed empires like ancient Egypt to lock their cosmic narratives in stone, turning performance into a tool of state-sponsored universal maintenance.
The inescapable conclusion is that the technology of communication is the ultimate architect of human culture.
Performance is completely inseparable from how a society records, transmits, and comprehends its truth.
Whether a culture stores its critical data in the dactylic hexameter of a spoken poem, the disruptive physical embodiment of a gorilla mask, or the complex hieroglyphs carved into a stone stele by a high priest.
The medium fundamentally dictates the conceptual reality of the people using it.
Exactly.
And that leads to a deeply provocative question that I want you to consider as we wrap up.
Yeah, let's hear it.
We established that ancient oral cultures designed their stories, their flat characters, their rhythmic formulas as highly optimized memory technologies to ensure survival.
And we established that the invention of writing shifted that cognitive burden onto stone and papyrus, completely rewiring the human brain and giving birth to both modern theater and the philosophical hatred of imitation.
If a shift from breath to ink caused a cognitive earthquake of that magnitude, what is happening to our minds right now?
That is a fascinating question.
As we completely outsource our memory to the cloud, to artificial intelligence, and to infinite, instantly accessible digital networks, what happens to the internal narrative architecture of the human brain?
If you never have to remember a fact because an algorithm remembers it for you, Are we losing the cognitive schemas that allowed us to build culture in the first place?
Or are we simply in the chaotic, overlapping friction of the highway on the verge of inventing a completely new, post-literate form of human performance?
Something beyond the stage, beyond the text, beyond our current comprehension.
It is something to seriously think about the next time you try to recall a loved one's phone number without looking at your screen.